you very much. Good evening, everybody. There's a sense of anticipation here as to the panel. It sounds like, you know, it might be a game show or something. We'd like you not to think of us as, if you're the generation that remembers this, as the brains trust or any questions. But this panel this evening is an opportunity not just for us to talk, but for all of us to have a chance to reflect and to ask some questions about what we've learned and what we've heard so far, within the general theme of how we develop and improve and take forward the idea of democracy as a liberating force, which is one of the central themes of the conference. And of course we've had presentations so far from John Cruddas on a virtue approach to politics, from Jenny Sinclair this morning on the practicalities of building the common good, and that very powerful session from Polly Jones this afternoon on international trade and democracy. And tomorrow we're going to go and look at developing democracy from a faith perspective from another part of the world, contrast our experience and put it in a global context. And then Alison is going to be doing a bit of action planning with us to think about the practical implications. So that's the kind of journey that we're on, and this space is an opportunity for us to reflect together. So how it's going to work is that we've got the four of us panellists. You may have noticed, if you know them, that none of us is Christine Allen and none of us is Russell Rook. Unfortunately, illness has taken them from us, so we have prevailed upon a couple of people to fill those slots, and thank you particularly to Pat, who's come in at the last moment. So I'm going to get people to introduce themselves, and then we're going to hear some short reflections from each of us on what's come up in the conference so far, and you're going to have a bit of time to chat amongst yourselves about that, and then we'll take questions and observations. So this really is a space, your space, to have the opportunity to have your say. Normally at this point one says that this is the session that stands between you and the bar, but this is actually the session that stands between you and the theatre of the oppressed. I think that's the first time I've ever said that as a conference. But no, seriously, it's going to be a very good theatre experience. On the programme it's for 9:40. I'm being ambitious and thinking that we might finish a little earlier than that, around about 9:30, but I won't cut anybody off unless they're going for far too long. So just to say, I'm probably the person you know least on the panel. I'm Simon Barrow. I'm the director of Ekklesia, which is a Christian think tank that's concerned really in two areas. First of all, we're thinking what are the new ways and pathways for the churches in the changing environment we find ourselves, a plural society. But secondly, with our commitment, our Christian commitment to peace and non-violence, to social transformation, to welfare for all and so on, how can we contribute to new thinking about public solutions that involve faith communities, but also develop the capacity of those of us in civil society to both question, witness to and challenge the powers that be and offer fresh pathways forward. So that's what Ekklesia is about. And I live in Edinburgh, in Scotland, so greetings from the People's Republic of Scotland to everyone here. So that's a little bit about me, and let me get Theresa and Martin and Pat to just say a little bit about themselves.
Hello, good evening everyone. I'm Theresa Byrne. For those of you who don't know, I'm a councillor in the London Borough of Ealing, a Labour councillor, which you might have guessed by some of my comments. I was originally born in Birmingham, like John Cruddas last night, solid Irish working class background. So I'm eternally grateful to my father for having an Irish passport. And so from that, myself and my two brothers have all been very well educated, thanks to my, in common with an awful lot of working class kids, being able to get a good education thanks to, the solid community roots of the working class. I now work in my day job at the University of London, heading up the department that produces all the certificates. So, fit in where I can my involvement in being a counsellor. As Simon said, we've had some really interesting, informative and inspiring talks. But one of the things that really picked up for me last night was when John Crowless was talking about virtues-based philosophy. I think that's an excellent idea, but I have great concern about any philosophy that's imposed downwards. I'm a great believer in formation of people, developing people, getting people involved in what is happening to them. And so the idea of, you just impose that this is the view, this is the ideology, is counter to what everything I believe. So I think it's a great idea and a great development, but I think one of the essential elements would need to be that bringing it out into the people, getting people to talk about it. One of the great sort of formations for myself was an involvement with the Young Christian Workers and the Cardiff philosophy of See, Judge, Act, which really was a way of formation for people, forming young people and those who are slightly older as it continues throughout life, into what is happening to them in their day-to-day, their existence and their faith journeys. And I think, if you want to create a whole new political philosophy, which is obviously where John's moving, whilst you have people talking about it, the actual embrace of that philosophy has to start right down in the absolute grassroots with the individual person, the individual communities, so that everybody can own and can actually feel that they are part of that development. So I think, that is the one thing I will carry away from this conference.
So the challenge really is how to root that kind of important theoretical discussion in, real life and engagement.
Exactly, and that's where you start to use organisations, for instance, like people who are, involved here, faith communities, you can use trade unions, they're an essential element, and it could actually be a way of linking people in the workplace with their trade unions, and getting trade unions need to increase their membership. A better way than introducing a new political philosophy where the people in the workplace can actually understand and relate that philosophy to what is happening in their particular workplaces, their issues.
Thanks very much, Judith. Martin, something about yourself and your own reflections so far?
Well, I just introduced myself a little bit at the beginning of that, but I'm a Londoner, as you can, I think I said, come from a Catholic family but not Irish. The only Irish in my family was my great-grandfather was a Protestant from Belfast. In 1979 when I was 12 I would have voted Tory if I could have voted, so I'll tell you that. Later on I did a degree in economics before going to seminary. I was originally ordained for my home classes at Brentwood. 97, joined the Passionists 4 years later. In the meantime, I've been involved in various ways for about 20 years with the London Simon community, homeless people. Worked in 5 years in East End parishes, where we were also involved with Telco, London Citizens. Just after I was ordained, to start getting involved in non-violent direct action, mainly around anti-war peace work. Through Pax Christ and also mainly Catholic Worker Movement and other groups. Most recently started to get involved with action around climate change. And now I'm living in Passionist House Hospitality for refugees in Birmingham.
And what's been your reflection?
Yeah, I guess the main thing that struck me was the whole thing about corporations. I guess from my economics background, I'm kind of aware of this. I guess traditionally we think of governments controlling things and trying to be democratic, but the reality of our world is that most of the biggest economic entities in the world today are corporations, and they're in no way are democratic, and they have a lot more power than the vast majority of governments. Corporations are like, a couple of hundred years ago you had to be a landowner in this country to have a vote, and to have a vote in the corporation, you have to have a lot of money. Even shareholders don't really have that much control most of the time. How do we this is I think the real big, how do we bring corporations under democratic control, democratise them internally, but also bring them under control of society, wider society, whether it's governments or in other ways. For example, they play our countries against one another. There's a race to the bottom in terms of corporation tax rate regulations, labour regulations, environmental regulations, government subsidies, all of which means, for example, governments end up with no money to do the good social work that we are used to them doing. So how do we stop that race to the bottom? Because they can move around the world globally, for example. Other kind of related things that says improving democracy. I think you have to have an equal society to have a functioning democracy. If the super rich or the super mega rich or corporations have all the money, then they have the power to put their message across. So how do we have to actually have a relatively equal society to have functioning democracy. How do we do that? I think one of the things that I learned about recently, I think there was a workshop here this weekend about the positive money idea, complete reform of the banking system. That would be certainly threaten a large part, I think, of the economic base of this country, especially London. So that's a big challenge to this country. I think other things, we personally, I think we have to, what can we do, witnessed by the quality of our lives to an alternative vision. It's not just words, there's millions of words, people can learn anything anywhere these days. There's information, getting submerged information. What we need as Christians, I think, need to do is witness to the alternatives by the quality of our lives. As a non-violent activist, part of that, I think, is non-violent direct action. Even the courts, actually, even the High Court, has recognised that civil disobedience is part of the democratic process. Doesn't mean you don't get found guilty and fined, whatever, but they recognise it as part of the democratic process and they take it into account. I think our church needs to recognise that too. There was a conference in the Vatican recently about non-violence. I think we as Catholics need to do more of it than we are.
Thank you very much.
I'm Pat Gaffney. I'm not even the +1 on here. I'm the also ran, and I feel the weakest one on the panel, but just bear with me anyway. I started my working life as a teacher. I taught for 6 years in Catholic comprehensive schools. I then moved on and went to work with CAFOD and worked with them on setting up their schools and youth development education program. I was there for 10 years and found that an extremely rich and informative experience that really laid the foundations for my becoming involved in issues of peace and social justice. From that I moved on to work with Pax Christ, and I've been with Pax Christ for the last 26 years, coordinating the work. That work ranges from advocacy work, lobbying on things like nuclear weapons, arms trade, child soldiers, military culture. It involves campaigning work around those issues. It involves peace education. We have a whole programme of outreach to schools and with young people. It involves spirituality, looking at the roots of our peacemaking. What's our peacemaking rooted in? Where do our values come from? Really trying to explore more and more what Martin was saying, this challenge of non-violence as a way of life, not just a strategy, but something that has to really take shape in the way we're moving forward and looking and dealing at issues in our world today. And part of that work in Pax Christ has always been to try and be in the public arena through witness, through protests, through presence. I'm a great believer in being present in places where there is violence or where violence is being prepared. I think there is a kind of role for people of faith to take that particular kind of path and that kind of action in parallel to other ways of challenging and working for peace and change. I've been encouraged, I only haven't had long to think about this, but things that have encouraged me, that I'm still working on from the last few days. One is a strand I see which has been helping us think about the way we go about doing our work in justice and peace, the quality of what we're doing. And so I think John started that a little bit last night when he started talking about the kind of virtue philosophy and was teasing out some of the things that had to do with, it had to do with wisdom, it had to do with compassion, it had to do with humility. And I liked those words sat well with me. I thought, yeah, there's good things in there. We picked up on that this morning in our prayer time. And again, I felt very kind of positively encouraged going to that micro-reading and being asked to reflect on that word hesed, qualities of mercy and kindness and the grace of God, but also being reminded that when we take those qualities on and we're using them in the best possible way to work for justice, there is a cost attached to that somewhere down the line. And that also fed into questions about leadership and, again, coming back to the quality of how we do what we do. I'm really kind of tested by that. And then we had Jenny, who seemed very clearly to be talking about a particular model, that kind of a reconciliation model of building the common good. So I was really encouraged by all of those things. They resonated with me. They challenged me to think about the kind of community we're building in our work for justice and peace. We're not just NGOs, we're not just faith groups, we're not just members of trade unions. I think we're building community in this work somehow or other. But then I had to grapple with some other things, and some of the things I was grappling with in Jenny's talk, I suppose, challenged maybe some of the way in which I've been working in peace and justice. I think a lot of our work in Pax Christ is about speaking up and acting up in the way we talk about, name, challenge, engage systems, the protest and challenge that she spoke about. And I just feel that with some of the issues that we face, the issues of war and violence, but more importantly, the things that underpin them, the economics that underpins them, the investment, the culture that allows war and violence to be maintained and present in our world today, have to be faced with speaking up and acting up, as much as with dialogue and a culture of engagement. So I suppose that led me to think that we need these parallel approaches. I don't think it's either or, I think it's parallel approaches. And the warning goes back to that thing of the Micah, with the mercy, with the kindness, with the grace of God as part of our discernment when we begin to take action. And that leads me to the third thing, which links in a little bit to what Theresa was saying, of our need for formation, so that we are really discerning very deeply about how we act. And we've had a tradition of that. I mean, I think this is about my 36th. How many conferences have we had? 38? I think I've been to 36 of them or something. And so I've been through ups and downs, and we've been here and we've been there and we're back again. But I think of the early part of our gatherings and forming community was that we had formation. We were using not the See, Judge, Act model, but we were using the pastoral cycle model, and that took us into the drawing on our experiences, the analysis, asking the right questions about what we were doing, why we were doing it, how we were doing it. That took us into actions that were deeply formed by our reflection. We didn't just go out and take action, but were deeply formed by different forms of reflection, and then we celebrated together. But it's all, to me, it's all a sense of community. It's coming out of community, authentic and action with integrity. It comes out of community of some kind or other. So I felt kind of really encouraged by certain things and strands and words, puzzled by others and not quite sure, grappling with them, and beginning to think, what do we need to help these two things come together? Years ago, I remember at conferences we would be talking about the justice and peace community and the charismatic community, the prayers and the doers, and we had to get over that hurdle because that was a false dualism in a way. But at the time it was a big thing for a lot of us, and we moved away from that. And I don't want to see us going down another track of dualism, that it's either this model or that model. I think we need to find ways of bringing a variety of models together.
Thanks, Pat. I mean, just to add a couple of thoughts to that on the question of formation, I think this is critical. It interested me that when John was speaking last night, he introduced the idea of virtue-based politics and didn't say an awful lot about, the virtue tradition, either in, the New Testament and the Gospels or in Aristotle and other kinds of places. And I guess he figured, well, he was talking to a predominantly Catholic audience, and you all know this stuff as well. But it's not a well-known and understood tradition, and of course where it's based on is that developing the virtues of compassion, wisdom, and solidarity, and many others that we can name, depends on communities that can actually nurture that. One of the areas of work that we're interested in Ekklesia is peace and non-violence, and I think that works itself out in a couple of ways. The first is, I found myself talking to numbers of church groups for whom the issues of peace are perhaps not as familiar as they are for many of us gathered here today. And one of the first questions I always like to ask people in those conversations is, how did you learn not to kill? And people kind of look at you as if that's a very strange question, or what does that mean? But I mean, the actual reality of the world that we live in and of human history is that the resorting to killing is not an unusual thing for human beings, and that actually non-violence is not just something that we say, well, that's a good idea and we instantly know how to do it. It's actually something that needs to be cultivated by practices of non-violence, by resistance, by communities that not only imbibe that message but begin to teach and share it. And it seems to me, I think this is the second time I've come to this conference. The first was many years ago, but this is one of the places where you can have that conversation and where there are people with links to networks and communities where those kinds of practices are actually developed, and that's of critical importance. And then related to that, because obviously Ekklesia is a think tank, so we're interested in policy and how you develop it, and ideas and how you develop them. And again, in that area of non-violence and peace, it's very easy to sit down and get involved in a fairly well-rehearsed argument, for example, between just war theory and pacifism and so on. But the way I would want to frame it is, before we start to introduce, as Theresa was saying, theory from on high or ideas from on high, let's perhaps start with people, Christian peacemaker teams, the ecumenical companies, or other people who are working in situations of deep conflict and trying to respond to those creatively out of the pool of non-violence. And let's see how the practice of that begins to reshape our theory around these kind of things, and then what might follow from that. So I think that's one way in which, in a sense, you can bridge the gap there between the idea of a virtue-based politics and how we as actors in churches and civil society can begin to develop and offer some different ways forward. Other quick thought is that John did, I can understand why he did this, he sort of posited a virtue approach as against a utilitarianism on one hand and a sort of economistic, rationalised, transactional way of handling things, and I think that's right, but the issue, Martin has raised the issue of how you handle corporate power, and economics looms large and enormously over a whole lot of those things. I think there was a question asked in an earlier question, an earlier session, which didn't get responded to, as to how we handle that. The size of the global economy, among the major actors who determine that, the fact that 70% of the money economy, the finance economy, is still based on speculation rather than on actually grounded human activity that furthers the common good. You know, how do you begin to grapple with that? And one of the projects, again, that we're beginning to work on in Ekklesia is to think about what an economy based on human caring would look like. I mean, one's thinking particularly of people who have informal roles as well as formal roles as carers in our society and are often treated as if somehow they're outside normal economic activity, or even a kind of burden because they have to be supported by the state in various ways and so on. Yet actually, caring for one another and caring for human flourishing is actually central to who we are and what we're about. If that's outside the economy, there is something wrong with the economy. So how can we begin to challenge some of those assumptions and begin to rethink economics and, you know, how we account to one another and what we account for? And again, there are some practical places where that kind of alternative thinking can begin, and it doesn't start from on high, it starts from where people are engaged in those activities. So there's a few ideas from all of us, or a few responses to what we've been talking about so far. And I'm going to invite you now to spend just a little bit of time talking to your immediate neighbour, or perhaps forming a group of three if that makes more sense. Really with two questions. First of all, for you, what are the, you know, what is perhaps an idea that's come forward that has begun to inspire you and something you want to take away and think more about? And secondly, is there a question that's come to you? And then when we've had a chance to talk about it a little bit, you know, amongst ourselves, we'll take some questions and observations, and we will respond to them, and perhaps we'll get a conversation going about those. Okay, so something that's inspired you want to take away, and maybe a question that's forming in your mind as a result of what you've heard and shared so far. So just in twos or threes for